There is something that I find hilarious about the difference in owners of Jeep Patriots versus Jeep Compasses, at least the first generation from 2007 to 2017. They're exactly the same vehicle. The sheet metal is different and the glass is different, but all the dirty bits underneath are interchangeable. They're the same car. And yet somehow when you get into discussion forums and Facebook groups and stuff like that, tons of people are always asking about doing suspension lifts and off-road stuff on the Patriots, and not nearly as much on Compasses. And it's weird because they're the same car. Anything that they have as far as capabilities, off-road ability, whatever, they're the same car. So the difference in whether or not someone thinks they want to do a suspension lift or big tires or all that other kind of stuff comes entirely down to, like, are there creases in the sheet metal? Is it boxy with the square bits, or is it less boxy? It's kind of a weird psychological study there. But this video isn't about people's weird hangups. This video is about whether or not you should lift a Jeep Patriot or a Jeep Compass. Let's take a look at how the suspension works so you can get a better idea of what actually goes on down there when you're trying to lift them. And the first thing we should probably go over is my Jeep Patriot lifted? No, it is not. This is the stock suspension height. I do have slightly larger than stock tires and I have slightly smaller than stock wheels, but the suspension ride height is stock on this vehicle. I could lift it. I mean, I have the ability to lift it. It's not financially out of my means and it's not mechanically out of my means, but I haven't lifted it. But let's take a look at what happens when you do lift them so you can make up your mind for yourself. To make this make sense, I'm going to jack up the suspension without a tire on it, just so that we have it at the normal level ride height. I jacked it up just enough so that this thing here is loose, and that means that the suspension right now is sitting at the same ride height that it would be if there was a tire here holding it up. To get ourselves oriented on what we're looking at here, this is the wheel mounting surface, so this is what the wheel bolts onto. This is the brake disc. This right here is your brake caliper. That pole right there is the strut. And then there's a spring seat at the bottom of the coil spring. And then the coil spring goes up into kind of an inverted bucket. And that's the part of the car's body that rests its weight on all of this so that the wheel can bear the weight of the vehicle. The rest of these parts under here, we have a lower control arm. In this case, there's really only one control arm up front because it's just a McPherson strut suspension. That means that unlike a conventional four-wheel drive with independent suspension that has two parallel arms and keeps the wheel assembly vertical as it cycles through its suspension movement, these McPherson strut suspensions only have a lower control arm. They do not have an upper control arm. Then this kind of rust-colored axle shaft here, well, that's the axle shaft. That's what transmits rotational power from the transmission to the wheel. And then this part right here that I'm pointing at that's kind of behind that, that is the sway bar, and then this is the sway bar end link. From a different angle, that's the same sway bar end link, and that just links up here to a tab that's welded to the side of the strut, and that just makes it so that when you're going around a corner, the car feels a bit more safe and more planted. This right here is the ball joint and outer tie rod end for the steering system, and that goes into your steering rack right there. So when you turn the steering wheel, this is what pushes the wheel left or right. The same lower control arm that we were looking at earlier extends back to this rear pivot point, and you can see that even at stock ride height, that already has a bit of twist to it. So that means that when the suspension cycles upwards because you hit a bump, that's going to pivot upward and become level and then go above level if you hit a really big bump. So what happens when you lift one of these cars? Well, this assembly here where the wheel is gets pushed down relative to the body of the vehicle. That's what provides the suspension lift, because of course the wheel is going to be on the ground, and if you change the difference between this and the body of the vehicle, you've lifted the vehicle. That's the easy part. The harder part is what happens back here to all these bits when you lift the vehicle. For now, we're just going to look at the front suspension. Just to get this out of the way, because people ask once in a while, there's no such thing as a body lift for these vehicles. There hasn't been a body-on-frame compact 4x4 in America in decades at this point. This is a unibody vehicle. There's no body lift possible on it. Even though there's several different companies that make suspension lifts, they really fit into two different categories. One kind uses a longer coil spring that just uses the stock geometry and changes where your static ride height within that stock geometry. and the other kind puts a spacer on top of the strut, which moves your vehicle's geometry some distance away from the body. And they each have their pros and cons. I don't really choose to use either one of those things, but if I was going to use one of them, I would use the longer spring kind. And if you stick around to the end, I'll tell you a cheap way you might be able to do that if you happen to feel like doing it anyways. So for this, I'm going to simulate what it would look like with your suspension if you were to change your ride height by 2 inches using longer coil springs. And to accomplish that, I'm just going to lower the wheel mounting assembly by 2 inches relative to the body. I've got the body held up by a jack stand, and we've got just a jack underneath the wheel mounting surface, and we're just going to lower that down to make it look like as if we lifted it 2 inches. That makes sense, I promise. This is what the suspension looks like at static ride height with a 2-inch suspension lift. And the first thing you'll notice is that right here, that sway bar mount is actually physically contacting or coming extremely close to physically contacting the lower control arm. This, of course, is static ride height, which means that if we were to go over a bump that would cause the suspension to cycle down any further, that would definitely hit. Remember that this car isn't actually even lifted, and here within the stock range of motion that comes close enough that there are witness marks. It's hard to make out here in the dark, but this actually does come in contact with that once in a while. Now I'm going to lower the jack so that the strut can reach its full extension. Now at full extension, you can see that the axle shaft comes pretty close to the subframe, but there is still a bit of room, so they're not going to come in contact with each other, just like it was engineered from the factory that way. You can see that the tie rod end is at a bit of an angle, but it's still not too terrible. However, if you were to start steering towards the right, that would get pulled that way, and it would end up with a little bit tighter angle than this. The part that is kind of concerning is back here at this rear bushing, because that is twisted up about as far as it can go. It's not really going to be able to twist any further. And so if you were to add a suspension lift by putting a spacer at the top of the strut there, that would be asked to twist even further, and it may not really have any more twist to give. Additionally, the sway bar end link, as you can see here now, it's in contact with the lower control arm. So if you were to try and make this droop even further by adding a spacer at the top of the strut, that would come in contact with the lower control arm with more violence, and that wouldn't be good for you. And of course, by bringing the axle shaft closer to the subframe here, those might come into contact with each other as well, and that would not work out too well for you. Another thing that might not be quite as obvious is that since this control arm moves in an arc, that means that when it's out here level like this, the wheel mounting surface is at its furthest distance out from the center there. When you start moving it downwards, when you start lifting the vehicle and that arcs downward, that brings this wheel mounting surface inward towards the center of the vehicle, which means that your wheels are going to look a little bit inset. But the other part of it that's a problem for alignment is that since your strut has a fixed upper location, your strut doesn't shift around with it, and you don't have parallel A-arms like you would on a more significant 4x4, that means that now your camber is going to be screwed up on this as well. It's a little difficult to make it out with this, but this is actually leaning in pretty bad. You've got quite a lot of negative camber on it. Even though that can be somewhat accounted for by using an eccentric camber adjustment bolt on here, that really only works for your static ride height, and then as the suspension cycles, because you're already at a wonky angle here on your control arm, that's going to come out quite a lot, and your camber is going to change wildly as your suspension moves around. It's not the end of the world, but it does affect your handling, and purely in a negative way. Now that we've looked at how the front suspension works, let's talk about how the rear suspension works. And you'll notice that I said talk about, because I don't have a 2-post lift to put the Jeep up on so we can look clearly at how the rear suspension functions. They didn't just copy the front suspension and do the same thing in back. They could have. The problem with that is that McPherson struts take up a lot of the interior volume of the vehicle that they're mounted on, and that's okay up front under the hood because you're not using that space for anything anyways. But in back, where your cargo volume is important, they couldn't really have half of that taken up by some strut towers. So they used a 4-link arrangement that uses smaller diameter struts pushed further out, and then some kind of links that hold the rear wheel assemblies in their position. There are some long trailing arms that kind of position the wheels fore to aft, and those don't really come into play too much in what we're talking about here. There are some lower lateral links. Those are what the struts mount to, and those kind of locate the bottom of the wheels where they're going to be. And then there are a couple of lateral links further forward. There's a couple that are sort of banana shaped and a couple of really short ones up front that handle your toe. And the reason that those become kind of critical to lifting one of these is that as the suspension cycles in the back, because it has all those links and some of them are kind of short, the suspension moves in sort of this. So when your wheels are going over bumps, they don't just go up and down, in a straight up and down sort of sense. They follow these weird arcs. That's okay at stock ride height because they were engineered to be balanced there. So they're kind of in the middle of their little arc. And they don't move too far. And in the end, they end up being pretty predictable with really good handling, as long as you're not, going over any completely crazy stuff. However, if you do a suspension lift where you've changed the static ride height and then you've corrected the angle that they sit at using adjustable arms, now when they cycle, they go way like this. Your rear camber gets really wacky under suspension movement, and that means even as the body leans going around corners, it changes quite a lot, and that makes your handling skittish. Skittish handling is not a good adjective. It's not something people really want to experience. So even though you can lift it and it'll still be fine to drive around, you're going to give up quite a bit in terms of handling. So the next part here, we're going to talk about whether or not you should lift it and also how to do it if you choose to. So to get this out of the way, if you're just lifting it for cosmetic reasons, you just want it to look a certain way because that's the style you're pursuing, lift it, go for it. I'm not going to tell you not to do it, and you wouldn't listen even if I did. So just go ahead and lift it. We'll talk about how to lift it in a minute. But first I want to address people who might be wanting to lift one of these to improve your actual performance off-road, because that is a whole different animal than appearance. If your objective is to maximize the off-road capability of a Jeep Patriot or a Compass, first let me address the person who's going to put a comment down there saying that they're not real Jeeps and they're not made for off-road. Try to keep up. I don't know why you always got to type that. Anyway, if your objective is to maximize the off-road capability of one of these Jeeps, no, don't lift it. You're not going to make it any better off-road, and a big part of that is the fact that you can't run big tires on one of these things effectively. It is geometrically possible to put 31s on one of these. I strongly advise against doing it, but it is geometrically possible to put 31s on one of these. The problem is that you don't have a low-range transfer case, and you have very limited engine torque and a very limited transmission. And because of those limitations, the larger a tire you try to turn, the less your effective torque to the ground is going to be. And so if you put an oversized tire on, your ability to climb up an incline or pull yourself out of mud or pull yourself over a log or something like that diminishes real rapidly. And so the largest tire before you really start compromising a lot is 29 inches. And lo and behold, 29 inches fits at stock ride height. Yes, you do get a slight increase in clearance if you go to a larger size tire than that, but it's not worth it. That's where your diminishing returns come in. And so since you don't need to run a suspension lift in order to put the largest tires you realistically should run on these in the first place, then you don't introduce any new compromises by just keeping it stock height. The other part of this is that it is an economy car. It's an economy car that's better off-road than most other economy cars, but it is still an economy car. You can put skid plates on it, and the skid plates that are available for it are substantial. And that means that if you have a low ride height and you have to drag it across some rocks or drag it across some branches or something like that, it's not really a big deal. Just drag it. That's what they're for. And of course, you're going to want to have recovery points like recovery hooks and a hitch out back in order to pull it in case you get hung up on something off-road. The extra 3/4 of an inch or whatever of ride height you might get by running a larger tire, not really worth it. The extra inch or two of belly height you might get by running a suspension lift, again, for all the compromises you get along with that, the fact that you don't get any real improvement in suspension extension from that, you just don't get much benefit from lifting it. So for that reason, just don't. You're not going to make it better off-road. If it's cosmetic, again, do what you want to do cosmetically, but don't kid yourself. It's just for looks, and that's fine, but it's not going to make it better off-road. So now that I've advised you not to lift it, let's talk about how to lift it if you're going to anyways. First thing with spacer lifts, which is the majority of them, don't do spacer lifts because you're going to introduce the ability to overextend the front suspension, and it's just not going to make it any better. If you're going to lift it at all, use coil springs. Murchison's makes longer coil springs that you can fit front and rear. They sell that along with the camber adjustments. It's a few $100s. It's not tremendously expensive as lifts go, so you can go ahead and install that and enjoy, I guess. If you want to do something really cheap from a junkyard, yes, you can. You can buy camber adjustment bolts for the front for like $3 or $4 online. That part's really cheap. The other part that's really cheap is the front and rear coil springs from an 09 or 10 Dodge Journey four-wheel drive. Yeah, the Dodge Journey minivans. You can't use the whole strut assembly because the whole strut assembly is way longer. But the springs are the same diameter. They just have a bit more lift. You'll get around an inch of suspension lift, give or take. You do have to run both the front and the rear ones. They are a little bit stiffer because the Journey is a heavier vehicle and it's made to carry more bodies. But in addition to being stiffer, therefore holding up more cargo as you're driving around with your little basket thing on the roof and your little ladder in the back window and whatever other goofy stuff you're going to do, that's going to be a whole lot cheaper than buying the springs from Murchison's. You may even be able to get them for close to free. So again, if you want to lift one of these things, coil springs are going to be a better quality lift than the spacers. And if you want to lift really cheaply with coil springs, you can use the coil springs from a Dodge Journey. I still don't advise it, but now you know.